from Kansas. I'm Laura Donnelly, and I'd like to welcome you to the Healing Path. I'm the founder of the Healing Path Conversation Series and Dancing with Ease Body Brain Balance. People hire me to teach them to move out of pain and into healing. These conversations with friends and colleagues offer many perspectives on healing. The thing we have in common is the concept that healing begins inside ourselves with a decision to heal, and it expands outward from there. We don't always know what healing is going to look like. We don't always know how long it's going to take. Often, it shows up in a form we totally didn't expect, but healing always happens. My guest today is Stephanie Duesing, and she is the author of Eyeless Mind. I read her book this past year, and I'm so excited to bring her onto the broadcast and let you get to know her and learn more about her book and her journey.
Hi,
Hi.
hi, Laura. Thank you so much for having me on your show today. I wanted to just let you know how very grateful I am to be here today, and thank you for helping me to raise awareness about CVI or cerebral/cortical visual impairment. Thank you.
I'm just I'm just excited that you wanted to come and talk about your journey, the highs and lows, and what you discovered because really you made a major discovery that contributed to understanding of this CVI or cerebral cortical visual impairment. God, that's a lot of words to say, isn't it?
It is. And back in 2017, I'd never heard of it. So, yeah, we've come a long, long way since 2017. For your listeners out there and the people watching, I just want to explain a little bit about who I am and what this discovery is. So, my name is Stephanie Duesing, and I am the author of Eyeless Mind, as Laura so kindly mentioned. It's a memoir about seeing and being seen. And I'm actually a music teacher by training, and I've spent my entire life learning or teaching people how to sing. Music has always been a huge part of my life. I taught music and chorus at the middle school level for 10 years, and then I took some time off when I had my son Sebastian. And I was asked to teach the children's choir, the K through 2. It was originally just a kindergarten choir, but it later became a K through 2 choir. And that really and having my own small child inspired a real interest in early childhood music education, and later I became a music garden instructor. Music garden is a music and movement program that was intentionally created when its creators saw this deficit in children who were having regular ed children who were having trouble with coordination and balance and fine and gross motor skills, and it was created intentionally to address those things. And so that's what I did. I ran a music garden program out of my home. And in January of 2017, we discovered that my straight A honor student, genius artist, and water polo playing son Sebastian was almost completely blind and no one knew, not even Sebastian himself. We were beyond devastated. We had absolutely no idea that Sebastian had any disability of any kind, and we just thought of ourselves as being the extremely lucky parents of a very gifted child, and we had just no idea that he was almost completely blind. And so we had a devastating battle, more than $150,000 in medical bills trying to get a diagnosis for a blind child who has always, all his life, appeared to be typically sighted. And I know a lot of people out there listening are going, how is this possible? And that's because cerebral/cortical visual impairment, which is a brain-based vision impairment that is entirely separate from ocular blindness. Ocular blindness is caused by damage to the eye and to the optic nerve. Cerebral/cortical visual impairment, which I'm going to call CVI from now on, CVI is it's a brain-based vision impairment. And I attended a lecture this past summer with Dr. Arvind Chanda and Dr. Gordon Dutton, who are both CVI experts. And Dr. Chanda was talking about how The amount of time it takes after the light actually hits the eye between when the signal from it's transmitted into an electrical signal by the eye, and it travels through the optic nerve past the lateral geniculate nuclei, or LGN, to the back of the brain. And they have actually measured the amount of time it takes between when the light hits the eye and when there's any conscious perception of sight. And it's about a tenth of a second after the light hits the eye when we begin to consciously perceive sight. And so, what that tells us is our eyes don't see anything on their own. We do not see with our eyes. Our eyes are just light collectors, and all the conscious perception of sight happens in the brain. And more than 40% of our brain is involved in visual processing, and different parts of the brain process different parts of vision, and they all communicate and talk to each other. So it's all connected. But
It's
the reality
amazing.
is, you don't even need to have eyes to see. We have people alive on Earth right now. There's a man named Daniel Kish. I use this example all the time so people can understand. Daniel Kish lost both eyes to cancer in infancy, and he taught himself to echolocate. Daniel has no eyes, but he can ride a bike. Daniel has no eyes, but he can read if the letters are three-dimensional. You can take Daniel places he's never been, and he can describe the visual scene accurately, what it is he sees. And when they put Daniel in the fMRI, which is a functional magnetic resonance imaging machine, which shows you what the brain is doing, not just what it looks like, Daniel's visual cortex lights up when he hears echoes, but not when he hears ordinary sounds. And so he literally sees with sound just like a bat. Well, in 2017, we discovered that my son also has unique visual processing. And so the discovery that we made was that my son Sebastian is the only person in the world known to process his vision verbally, which means that he sees with words, just like a bat
Wow.
sees with sound. And so Sebastian uses an enormous memorized verbal taxonomy of descriptors to identify everything and everyone he encounters in daily life. And back 2 years ago, I used to wear glasses all the time because I had cataract surgery 2 years ago, so I don't wear them anymore. But my characteristic, they used to be tall blonde glasses. I don't wear the glasses anymore. And so when my son thinks those words to himself, he literally gets a momentary glimpse of what I look like. It's just a flash of understanding that leaves no trace in his visual memory. It's just a momentary flash. And Sebastian actually spent 6 hours in the fMRI for the Laboratory for Visual Neuroplasticity at Shepard's Eye Research Institute. And Dr. Lotfi Marabet actually captured Sebastian's use of verbal mediation to process his vision in the fMRI. Just like with Daniel, they captured his use of echolocation in the fMRI. And so he actually published a paper on Sebastian's use of verbal mediation to process his vision last fall in Neurobiologia in collaboration with Dr. Barry Cran, who is the head of optometrics at the New England Eye Low Vision Clinic at the Berkman School for the Blind. And so this is a true story that's actually happened and it's been proven. And yeah, so we had quite an
Wow.
experience because, like you said, I did make a major medical discovery. And I'm really, really happy to say now that we survived it because it was an extremely challenging experience. We had,
Um,
yeah, go
how
ahead.
long did it take you to get the correct medical diagnosis?
So we discovered it in January of 2017. And like I said, CVI, it can be an entirely invisible disability. There's no way to tell that my son has any disability of any kind, academically, socially, or physically. My son was on the water polo team. We had no idea, so it was very challenging. We It took about 6 months from the time I first discovered it, and the saddest thing I think was we happened to be going through old photos, and we were literally I'm that mom who made my son a baby book, and I'm totally not crafty, and I was so proud of the fact that I made it through the baby book, and then I never ever did another scrapbook or photo album again. And so we were looking at pictures that I had never, we hadn't looked at for years. And I was narrating to Sebastian about who was in the picture because our family spread all over the place. And there were a lot of pictures of him with people that he wouldn't necessarily remember. So I was saying things like, oh, look, there you are with your cousin from Canada that we haven't seen for, 7 years or whatever. And doing that for about half an hour. And then all of a sudden, this really gorgeous picture of him cropped up. And I just said, "Oh, look who's that." And so here's my son, who is an only child, who's been looking at pictures of his own face as a baby, toddler, now preschooler for half an hour, you know, and there was just crickets. And finally he just said, "How should I know?" And back in 2017, I had never heard of prosopagnosia or face blindness. I didn't know that it was possible for a human being to be face blind. I had never heard of CVI. I had no idea any of this was even possible. And here's my son, who has been wearing glasses and then contact lenses since he was, I think, in first or second grade, and has had his eyes checked every year reliably and has passed every vision test every year because he has normal acuity. And so I knew immediately, I'm like, obviously not recognizing his face. And then I started quizzing him on like my face and my husband's face, and we're all 15 years younger and, less gray hair and, a little less overweight, but still obviously us. And he's guessing. He was guessing. And so, you know, I wasn't scared for him. I just thought it was like a quirk, you know?
So like in that moment, what happened to you? I mean, like I saw that you were like, oh well, he didn't recognize himself, but maybe he'll recognize me. Maybe he'll recognize his dad,
Oh,
and so
just all
you,
the hairs on my back stood up. I mean, because I'd never heard of this. I didn't even know it was possible. And you have to realize Sebastian is a very gifted artist who draws and paints faces and everything else that interests him with photographic realism when he wants to. Right. So here he is
yeah.
drawing beautifully detailed, realistic faces, and he's not recognizing his own. And I was like, what? Right? That makes no sense. Of course, now, of course, we know about, you know, there's just so many things we've learned. So to make a long story short, that very night I was researching, like not recognizing faces, and there was so little factual information about CVI that I could find, and I didn't even know the word CVI back then. I was just trying to figure out like problems with facial recognition. It took me a while before I actually found any information. And when I found, a lot of it was wrong, but I didn't know that at the time. And I was told back in 2017 in my online research that face blindness, I discovered it was a real thing, but I was told that it was very, very rare. That's what I read. And, just like a month ago, the New York Times ran an article talking about how 1 in 30 people have face blindness.
Oh
Right. So
wow.
it's totally not rare. No, it's a very common symptom of a very common visual impairment.
Well,
And
see, I was. It makes me think. My husband, like when he asked me, like, well, remind me who that is again. And so, like, I described them. I said, well, they're about this tall. They have this color hair, and they wear glasses. And he goes, I never see glasses. He just doesn't recognize glasses on a face.
mhm,
It doesn't. It's not important to him.
yeah, or it may not just be registering. He could be one of 30, you know?
And I mean, and he knows everything else, you know. But
Right.
it's but this thing that you said too, like this processing goes back here, and a tenth of a second, and how many pieces of information flow into the brain so fast and then get put together, like you said, because the different parts of the brain take in different pieces of information from the light.
Right. So if you take your right hand and you touch right here above and behind your right ear, that's where the right fusiform gyrus of the brain is, and that's where facial recognition takes place. So, yeah, different
Oh,
parts of the brain do different things, and that's facial recognition. People who have prosopagnosia or face blindness very often also have another condition called topographical agnosia, which is an inability to recognize their surroundings because that's processed right close to there. And so if one is damaged, the other one very often is damaged as well. And so that actually is what my son has. The very next day after we discovered he was face blind, that's the day we discovered that my son, my straight A honor student, who was sailing through the most complex AP and honors math and English courses and everything, had taught himself to navigate by counting his steps and turns and had been navigating our own home, our small neighborhood, and his extremely architecturally challenging high school that way without anybody knowing. And he assumed that that's how everybody navigated. He'd had no idea that what he was doing was different. And that's when I got scared for his safety because it was no longer just a quirk, this was a safety issue. My son was intending to go off to art school in Chicago. I'm like, he can't go off to college counting his steps and turns. He needs to have actual professional orientation and mobility training services because he needs to learn how to navigate by using technology because he's been literally navigating by following us and just so quickly learning the number of steps it takes because he's been doing it all his life, but he needs to be able to go to different locations where he doesn't have us to follow to live independently. And that's when I got scared. And I immediately made a doctor's appointment with Sebastian's neuropsychologist that very next day when it was business hours. And I was using the correct medical terminology to describe my son's symptoms from that very first appointment. And we were told, I can't help you, and I don't know anyone who can. Good luck with that. And we saw
Wow.
ophthalmologists, neuro-ophthalmologists, optometrists, neuro-optometrists, neurologists, neuropsychologists, and we traveled across the country looking for anyone who could correctly diagnose my son and prescribe a couple of weeks of orientation and mobility with the white cane. You must have a diagnosis of visual impairment in order to access that. And so we had to get a diagnosis. And the problem is, what we've discovered is that CVI is actually the number one cause of visual impairment in the developed world, and scientists have known this for more than 10 years. This is not new, and it does not have a diagnostic code. And so what happened to us is
Gosh.
actually common. People who have CVI are routinely misdiagnosed with autism, behavior disorders, learning disorders, emotional problems. They are labeled everything except what they are, which is visually impaired. And obviously, because you can appear to be typically sighted, like my son does, you can look like you're fine and still just not be fine. And the saddest thing I think of all is that I think a lot of people who have CVI, actually, it's pretty easy to tell. I have a dear friend who didn't get diagnosed till she was 26 years old. She was misdiagnosed with autism. And yes, you can absolutely have autism and CVI at the same time. You can have both, but a lot of times autism is misdiagnosed as CVI, or CVI is misdiagnosed as autism, right? And so this is very, very sad. I know a lot of people in the CVI community who, like my son, went misdiagnosed for many years because this happens all the time, and they suffer terrible, terrible trauma, especially from not getting needed orientation and mobility training services. Because I will tell you, it is terrifying to be blind and have nobody around you know that you're blind. It is terrifying, and my son was horribly traumatized by this, and the only symptoms that we had that there was anything, even the slightest bit off with my son, was what appeared to be mostly mild anxiety. He had mild separation anxiety in early childhood, and it was swept under the carpet and ignored and, just like not a big deal from his doctors, from his teachers, because he was academic. He was making eye contact. I have photos of my blind son who can't recognize his face or anybody else's making regular, consistent eye contact from his earliest days. My son had all normal developmental milestones despite being almost completely blind and took the training wheels off his bike when he was 4.
Oh my gosh.
So we
And
had
I
no.
remember he rode the bike,
Oh,
so
yeah.
so his balance was really good.
Oh, of course.
And
So,
a
yeah.
lot of people I used to teach, dancing a lot, and a lot of people often orient and know their balance in space based on what they're seeing.
Mhm,
And a lot of times what happens to dancers, young dancers is when they, releve, go up higher on their feet, they
mhm.
keep their eyes in the same place as they were when they were standing flat on their feet, and this messes up their whole alignment. And early I said, "You have to let your eyes go up. You have to let what you see be at a different level
Mhm.
when you're higher." And this intrigued me, and so then I spent one summer studying and with my eyes closed. I just took the whole ballet class, most of the bar, when you're standing there. When I got in the center, I opened my eyes, but later doing slow exercises, I did them with my eyes shut, and my balance changed incredibly in terms of my physical balance, my ability to balance internally, which he
That's
must
so
have been
interesting.
doing. I know, he must have been doing that all along.
So I'm an early childhood music and movement specialist, and the vast majority of children who have CVI, or a lot of them, I don't know, I think we're going to learn that there's a lot that aren't. We're seeing numbers now. There's research coming out of the UK showing that 1 in 30 students in a regular ed classroom have symptoms of CVI, which makes CVI more prevalent than autism. And I will put links to different articles from the National Institute of Health and from Optometry Times, for the people listening, so you can see it's not just coming from me. These statistics aren't. Um, but I want you to know that Sebastian received intensive music and movement therapy from birth just by accident of having me for a mother. And there are more than 2 decades of research demonstrating that music and movement in early childhood, high quality music and movement experiences in early childhood have more than 2 decades of research demonstrating that children who receive that before the age of 7 have better balance, coordination, fine and gross motor skills, proprioception, which is knowledge of where your body is in space, which comes in handy when you cannot see your body, right?
Right.
Um, Not only that, but also auditory discrimination and language development. Children who receive high quality music experiences before the age of 7 also have better language development, better reading and math ability, and also IQ scores. And there are more than 2 decades of research showing that actually musicians have different brains than non-musicians. They've known for more than 2 decades. Music and movement is the only activity known to science that stimulates the auditory, motor, and also the visual cortices of the brain simultaneously. There are no other activities that do that that science knows about. And the reason that's important is because when the auditory, motor, and visual cortices of the brain are stimulated at the same time, that forces both sides of the brain to work together through the corpus callosum in a way that no other activity can mimic.
Hang on one second. Something is going on in my machine that doesn't belong here. And I can't figure it out.
It was one of my first summer intensives in New York.
Okay, that's weird. Can you hear that?
I can, yes. I think we've got another something going on.
Ballet and modern.
It's,
Because
I wonder if you're
I
picking up.
know what it is. Okay, I can fix it, I think. Go. Sorry
Oh,
about
that's
that.
okay. Yeah, we'll
The
just,
computer is, well, okay, so now if I was blind, how confusing would that be?
right?
You know, and at the same time, something you said really early is that Sebastian had no idea that everybody around him wasn't doing exactly what he was doing.
Oh, of course. Yeah. He had no idea. He just assumed. And that's true for all people who are born with CVI. When they're born with it, they don't know that their vision is different. They assume that you can see what they see. And so
Well,
they
I think,
assume that their vision is typical. And so people who are born with CVI cannot tell you, oh, there's something wrong with my vision, because they literally do not know. They've never seen with the brain that sees. And that's why they never say, oh, I can't see. I mean, it just they don't know that their vision is different. They just don't know. And so they assume that you're seeing what little they can see. And I know that there's a lot of people listening to this today are still stuck back on how can someone see with words and how could he be blind, because all they know about is ocular blindness and they assume everything is dark. So I'd like to take a moment to address that too, because I know there's a lot of people questioning what CVI is. So ocular blindness is different from CVI. It's where the optic nerve where the eye is damaged, and that's the stereotype of how being blind is everything is dark. And I want to be really clear that that's a stereotype. The reality is the vast majority of ocularly blind people have some level of light perception. They do. Blindness is a spectrum. It really is. And it's a stereotype to think that being blind is where everything is dark. That's a tiny minority of blind people. It's a minority. So that's ocular blindness. So with CVI, or brain-based vision impairment, it's easier to talk about what Sebastian can't see before I talk about what he can see. And so we talked about how he has face blindness. That's one thing. So he can't recognize his face or others. He also has topographical agnosia, which is the inability to recognize his surroundings. People who have topographical agnosia, it doesn't matter how many times they walk into an area or they see a scene, nothing ever looks familiar. It's like being out in the ocean surrounded by a swirling, colorful fog. He sees color, but nothing is recognizable because he also has something called object agnosia. Object agnosia is the inability to recognize objects. So, no object, no person, no scene, nothing ever looks familiar. It's always just this colorful fog of swirls of blobs of color and unrecognizable things. And out of that swirling blob of color, the only parts of Sebastian's brain that see the way that we see, that really recognize the way that we recognize, are the areas of the brain that recognize words, letters, numbers, and simple shapes. Remember, we talked about how the right fusiform gyrus is where facial recognition takes place. Well, there's different areas of the brain that are involved in recognizing words, letters, numbers, symbols. And so we just lucked out. We got lucky, and the areas of my son's brain that recognize symbols, words, letters, numbers, simple shapes, that area was not damaged when he was born. And so he has visual access to numeracy and literacy. And so my blind son actually learned to read at the age of 2.5. He taught
Wow.
himself to read at the age of 2.5, and he was actually reading and understanding the old Nancy Drew stories that I remember struggling with as a second and third grader, which have all that lawyerly language in there. If you've read the originals, do you remember those? Those are not an easy read. And he was 4 years old and loving those books, right? Reading them on his own. So we just had academically no idea there was anything wrong. And in fact, Sebastian actually went through the grade promotion process. His school came to us and told us that they could not meet his needs in the grade he was in because he finished the fourth grade math book first quarter of third grade without any help or assistance from us whatsoever. We didn't even know he'd done it, you know? And so this was a kid that desperately needed it more. And we actually fought the grade promotion for social reasons because we didn't want to tear him away from his friends. And it turned out that grade promotion was the least bad of the three choices we were given by our school. And we ended up going along with it. And it turned out to be a beautiful choice for my son. But it was a very thoughtful process that we went through. And so academically, Sebastian, and again, this should not be news to people because the reality is Dr. Oliver Sacks was the author of The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. He's a famous neuropsychologist. He was the subject of the movies. We have known about CVI for 100 years. We've known about it since World War One. It has been researched since World War One. Dr. Oliver Sacks, the famous author and neuropsychologist, had exactly what my son has. He was famous for being face blind. He was famous for his inability to recognize his surroundings. He had topographical agnosia, just like my son, and he suffered terribly from not getting orientation and mobility training services to help him live with it. He suffered from it. He felt he missed out on life, and he did because it was so difficult for him. And it's just terrible what happens to these children, to these adults, you know.
Well, I'm thinking one thing too is like children in school. If the part of the brain that is the symbol and word and letter part
Mhm.
that Sebastian has, if that part's damaged, they could easily just be misdiagnosed as dyslexia or
Yeah.
reading problems or
And I'm so glad you brought that up because I have a very dear friend who just discovered that her daughter has CVI at the age of 12 last year. Just like my son passed for typically sighted, they had no idea she had any disability like that. This is a brilliant parent and a brilliant child. Both of them are brilliant. And just like my son, this child is perfectly capable of describing her functional vision now that she knows that it's different. She didn't know before. And this parent is an educator, highly intelligent, highly engaged. They homeschool and they have done every reading intervention under the sun since this child was like 5 years old. and with no success. It's been a horrible, horrible struggle. And I will tell you, they started Braille, I think about 4 or 5 months ago, and this now 13-year-old child is reading at grade level for the very first time.
Wow.
And
So,
again, this is what happens when children are, they're misdiagnosed because our optometric exams are out of date.
right. Well, and it's all kinds of things. And they started this 20, 30 years ago with different learning styles.
Right.
You know, that that maybe this child isn't delayed or developmentally missing something, they just process differently. And then I can see, it sounds so funny, I can see if the eye test, they do the thing, you go to the eye doctor and they do all these things with the tests, and your retina's fine, and the curvature is fine, and the organ of the eyeball seems to
Mhm.
be okay. They could easily miss this. I mean, I got incredibly nearsighted really quickly. But I have a friend who thinks that it's because when my father died, I didn't want to see forward. I had some intuitive stuff, and she said you just didn't want to see very far away from you because you didn't want to see what was coming. And so the nearsightedness, you can see everything close up. Nobody knew. I was short. They put me in the front row. So a lot of times just trying to manage a classroom of all different types of people, it would be very easy. You put all the short people in front. So I'm nearsighted, I'm short, I can see the board, everything's good. I can read all the assignments,
Mhm.
you know.
But put you out on the playground and, could you find your friend on the other side, right? No, right?
You know what? I have no idea about that. I have no, I'll have to think about that now. But what happened is that my mom was driving, and again, driving is when one of the times that you had in this book that I remember that you and Sebastian had this conversation about where where is he and how does he get places, and he wanted to know how you got to wherever you were driving to. And I asked my mom, I said, how do you know where to turn? She said, I read the street sign.
Mhm.
And I said, that blurry green thing?
Yeah, you didn't even know there was words on there. I know. I have very severe vision as well before even my ultra thin lenses and my glasses were like Coke bottles, right? And so I have those memories too of like I remember seeing stars for the first time when I got my glasses in second grade and being amazed that stars existed and like to know that you could see individual leaves on a tree that hadn't fallen on the ground. I just thought trees had big blurry green things at the top. It was a big cloud, right? I didn't know that you could actually see the individual leaves. Yeah. Yeah, it's a
So again,
revelation, right? Vision
yeah,
is
and so
yeah,
one of the things I'm hearing from this story is not to assume.
yeah.
But this is what they do with children, with all of those markers.
Well, and
This
I
is normal, and this is not normal. And because of Sebastian's other skills, he could compensate in a way that he appeared normal.
right. And that's what people with CVI have to do. And like I said, I mean, we have actual research coming out of the UK showing that 1 in 30 students in a regular ed classroom have symptoms of CVI. 1 in 30. And so this is they learn to compensate. They learn to get along and to try to appear to fit in with everybody else. And Sebastian has said numerous times, like he always knew that he was much more freaked out about going places than everybody around him was, and he had absolutely no idea why. He didn't know. He didn't know that they could see stuff that he couldn't see. He had no way of knowing that because he'd never seen with a brain that saw. And so, yeah, don't assume just because someone, this actually, I'm so glad you said don't assume because so often, even in the CVI world, there are so many misconceptions and myths that have to be broken, right? For example, there's, just the myth that, well, if a child's making eye contact, then they're fine. Well, like I said, I have photo after photo of my blind son making regular, consistent eye contact from birth, and he can't recognize his face or anybody else's. And we know why. We actually
Right.
know why. According to Dr. Gordon Dutton, he has something called affective blindsight, and we know this. Sebastian has always been incredibly sensitive to facial expressions. My son actually is perfectly capable of recognizing facial expressions, even though he cannot recognize the faces themselves. And so that's a high motivator to look at faces as an infant. If you can get the smile, right? You and so Sebastian's always looked at faces. So you can't assume that just because your child's making eye contact that their vision is normal or that they don't have face blindness. That's looking is a behavior. Right? When we go as typically sighted people and we go to the optometrist's office and we sit down in the chair and we look at the eye chart, that doesn't mean we saw everything on the eye chart, right? We looked at the eye chart. Looking is a behavior, right? I mean, whenever ever I looked at the eye chart, all I ever saw, if the big E was just like a blur, like a Rorschach test thing. I never saw the big E, right? So I looked at the eye chart and imagine if we were told, as typically sighted people, oh, well, you looked at the eye chart, so you're good. And this happens to people who have CVI all the time. Well, you looked at it, so you're fine. I know you saw it because you looked at it. That's what doctors do. And that's what happened to my son over and over and over. He looked like he was fine. So he couldn't possibly have anything wrong. And we were actually labeled crazy by the medical establishment and repeatedly verbally and emotionally abused. I was actually physically threatened by a neuro-ophthalmologist that we'd never even met. He walked into the appointment that way and without introducing himself, put his fist in my face and screamed at me in front of my blind son. Yeah, and we had $150,000 in medical bills, and I had to actually take my son to Paris for a week-long research study with Dr. Sylvie Chakran, who is the head of the unit of vision and cognition at La Fondation Rothschild. And she did a week-long research study on Sebastian. And the reason that's important to know is because my son, like many people who have CVI, has a normal appearing MRI. Here's another myth.
Oh, wow.
All the time, people who CVI families, they're told that their child can't possibly have CVI because they have a normal MRI. Well, an MRI only shows the structure of the brain. It does not show the function at all. And so when we went to Paris, Dr. Chakran did a SPECT scan on my son. And a SPECT scan is a nuclear medicine test, and you inject a little bit of nuclear medicine into the bloodstream, and then it lights up the parts of the brain that are receiving blood flow. And any of the parts of the brain that are not receiving blood flow are dead tissue. And so
Wow.
we found significant brain damage to the right fusiform gyrus of my son's brain and elsewhere because I almost died giving birth to my son. And I mean, we know that's what caused it. I coded from the epidural. I was diagnosed with preeclampsia and he was full term, but I almost died giving birth to him. And, my blood pressure crashed to 40/26. And the last thing I remember is getting the 6-inch needle of epinephrine in my heart and being, yeah. And then I
Yeah.
was unconscious for 6 hours of my labor. Right. And so
Oh my gosh.
we actually know that's the event that caused this for my son because yeah, there was nothing else. And not only that, but Sebastian, in addition to being able to see words, letters, numbers, simple shapes, because that part of his brain still functions, right? That visual part of his brain, Sebastian inherited a partial photographic memory for text from me. And
See, yeah.
and mine disappeared after he was born. And I just, I wasn't writing
Wow.
research papers. And all of my friends in my mom group were talking about how ditzy they felt with their new mom brains and, kind of forgetful. And I didn't know. I had a mini stroke and I didn't even know. I mean, my
Oh,
face wasn't
wow.
sagging you know, and I know now I often have problems with word recall, like, I'm about to say something and the word for it just disappears, and so I have that. I've had it for years. And I just was like, wow, I'm just, motherhood sure changes you.
Well, okay. And it does change you for life. And the I okay. How, in terms of you, we talked at the beginning before we came online that the stress of all of this caused you to gain weight. And when did Sebastian graduate from high school?
Let's
2019?
see. Was it 2019? It's terrible that I can't remember. We've had so much, it was so stressful that whole time. There were other health issues that came after that. You know, so I think it might have been 2019.
Well, and
Yeah,
then
it must have been 2019. Yes, it was. Yeah.
okay, because then COVID came, and I'm sorry,
Right. Yeah.
that's just a gap in
Yeah.
my
Yeah,
in
well,
my memory.
because we were labeled crazy by the medical establishment, we were still working on getting my son a diagnosis for his vision for his CVI when he came down with a very severe chronic illness that we also struggled to get a diagnosis for, and we were labeled crazy, and so like it was terrible. So that's all just a blur for me. We had a real struggle. So yeah.
But you also said that now what I want to come to is that the process of healing isn't a once and done.
Oh no.
It's not just getting the diagnosis was the beginning of
Yeah.
getting him the training and skills he needed to be able to navigate in the world. Supporting him took just tremendous resources, which parents often give with very little. They just do it. They don't know. They just do it, and it's afterwards you're like, I'm exhausted, or I suddenly have things I didn't used to have, and I need time to take care of myself. And you said you had lost a lot of weight just slowly and gradually. So you're in the healing journey yourself.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. So I want to just say weight has been an issue for me, really my whole adult life. And, self image issues. And, I'm a survivor of life threatening child abuse. My mother had Munchausen by proxy, and that's also part of my story. So, and I won't go into that here, but it's a miracle that I'm still here. I was repeatedly and deliberately abandoned by my mother beginning when I was 4 years old. So I came home from my first day of kindergarten in a cop car. And, she just did this over and over for attention and sympathy. And, so there's a lot of issues. And I'm really, really grateful because I had the ability and support from my husband. It was when I was pregnant with my son where like the blinders came off, the blinders of denial of like how bad this abuse is. When I realized I didn't have that fantasy grandma who was going to bake cookies and babysit. I had the grandma who might actually harm and very likely would harm my child and intended to and was starting to talk about it to me,
Oh,
you know?
wow.
Yeah, and so that's when it was like, "Oh my goodness," and so it was devastating. I went through wonderful therapy, to learn to deal with, like, what can I safely do? And the reality was I could not safely have my mom as part of my child's life. And it was the best decision my husband and I ever made. We made it with the help of an outstanding therapist. And we learned about codependency and we learned about family systems theory and we did all that work. And, we created a safe, loving environment in our home for our son to grow up in, and then, realized 15 years later that we didn't even know he was blind the whole time, because it's an invisible disability. CVI can, like I said, be entirely invisible, and you can
Well,
have a kid go through all this. So to get back to your question, I didn't forget what you're
that's
asking
okay.
about with the weight. Um, and stress eating is a thing, and a comfort eating. There's a reason they call it comfort eating. Right? It's comforting and it's when you're going through a very stressful experience like what we did, month after month of, literal verbal and emotional abuse from medical professionals over the most minor of things, in my opinion, right? I mean, a couple of weeks of orientation mobility training, we were treated like we were asking for like illegal narcotics or something, or, like we wanted to have him surgically, like all his limbs amputated. We were treated like we were dangerous criminals, you know? And it was so bizarre. It was such a bizarre experience. And so the eating, it's just like eating we spend a lot of time in the car, Sebastian and I, going from doctor's appointment to doctor's appointment with this and the other condition that he has. And, it was easier to pick up fast food, so I gained this tremendous amount of weight. And it's so interesting because I want to really thank the Perkins School for the Blind. This past summer, they hosted the CVI Collaboration for Change conference. And at that conference, they had Dr. Michael Chiang, who is the director of the National Eye Institute, which is a division of the National Institute of Health. He was the keynote speaker. And at that conference, I mean, there's been so much change since 2017. I just want to really emphasize we are so much better. I mean, we have a long way to go for CVI, but then this past year, for the very first time, the NIH has recognized CVI as the number one cause of visual impairment. It is more common than ocular blindness in developed nations. Right?
Wow.
So this is a huge step forward, and they have identified CVI as an area of interest, or I can't remember the exact terminology, but what that means is that CVI actually qualifies for federal research funding for the very first time this year. And so these are huge steps forward. In August, we went back to Boston to see Dr. Lotfi Marabet at the Laboratory for Visual Neuroplasticity. And we went in 2018 for the first time, and that's when he captured Sebastian's use of verbal mediation to process his vision. Since that time, they have completely changed the entire study based on what they've learned from Sebastian the first time. And now Dr. Mirabat is tracking the verbal IQ scores of everyone who comes through the study because they have figured something out about the connection between language and vision based on what they learned from my son. Sebastian participated again in the study, and according to Dr. Mirabat, he is the most studied individual with CVI. And so we
Wow.
have given a gift to the world. I mean, that's why it was so important. I knew this was an important discovery because it could help so many people. Sebastian quite literally taught himself to see with words through art. He has always been an artist. I say he was born an artist. And the reality is, it didn't cure his vision. Learning his use of verbal mediation did not make his vision typical. It did not cure his vision. The neuroplastic adaptation to his brain didn't heal his brain damage. All that brain damage is still there. You can see it on the SPECT scan, and that's why he's blind. But it did give him the ability to get flashes of understanding of what vision is. He gets flashes, and that's a really handy, useful skill. And I know that my son taught himself that from infancy. He memorized the verbal characteristics of how we describe what everything and every person looks like, right? Like an orange basketball, round orange thing with black stripes, right? Like, yeah, tall blonde glasses, except I don't have my glasses, That's what he has to do. For my son, he wakes up every day in a world that he describes as like being in an alien universe where nothing ever looks familiar except for words, letters, numbers, simple shapes. It's like being in this colorful fog, and every once in a while a sign floats by. It's not connected to anything you can recognize. It's just that's all there is for his visual world. You know.
So it seems to me that one of the reasons it's hard to diagnose this is because of all the areas of the brain that light goes to and is processed in these different areas.
Hmm.
The doctors just have to really be curious. They have to not know. They have to be curious and discover, because nobody's going to have the exact same symptoms that Sebastian
Exactly.
has, or the girl who is learning Braille and able to read at her intellectual level for the first time. She must be so excited.
Oh, it's
You
amazing.
know,
Yeah. And I just want to address that because what Dr. Gordon Dutton says is that if you've met one person with CVI, you have met one person with CVI because where the brain damage happens is fairly random, right? And it's unique to each person. And so there are commonalities. People who have CVI often have commonalities in the way that their vision is affected, but they're also, unique parts, and that is exactly why it's been hard to come up with an agreed upon diagnostic code. And so it's really nice because, we're working towards that now. And so I wanted to get back to your question about the healing and the weight because I didn't forget. And so I just wanted, oh, I can't hear you. I lost you. I can't hear you.
Now.
Yeah, there you're back. So after this conference this summer, and I just want to talk a little bit about how, like, the stress that I had from this entire experience when you see the type of progress that has been made with the National Institute of Health and everything Perkins has done to create this new assessment. They've created a new CVI assessment called the CVI protocol, which the paper on Sebastian is part of the research used to underpin and back, what they're saying about CVI to help capture and diagnose people more quickly, hopefully before they're, 15 or 12, be great if you could do that earlier. And it it's irrational to feel like you are alone in this world working on this problem, but the reality was I felt very alone because I was very lonely, for so many years, all this time trying to get a diagnosis and feeling so alone, and after that conference, it was just like a light switched off for me. It was like, okay, all right, now I can focus back on myself because, like, I'm not alone in this anymore. We've got the big guns working on this project, and it's not just me shouting into YouTube going, "We have a real problem here, and there's kids out there that are blind and nobody knows, and they don't even know, and it's terrifying, and they need to be helped." And so, yeah,
So it's an amazing journey of courage and persistence that you went on. And you knew, right? You knew inside something was wrong.
That's the funny thing that you say that because I actually, yeah, Sebastian and I have talked about this many times. We had such small little hints that there was something wrong, and it was so mysterious. And yeah, I would say absolutely, like my mother's instinct that there was something wrong, but we had no idea what to pin it on, right? And so, for example, Sebastian, he had what appeared to be mild separation anxiety. He cried every day at drop off for 2 years of preschool, even though he was one of the older kids. He has a fall birthday, he was born, and he was very emotionally mature and very social. He had all his best friends in his preschool class. He loved his teacher. He loved the toys there. And so it made absolutely no sense that this very academic kid who loved to read, who was already reading as a preschooler, and loved his best friend in there and loved his teacher, why he was crying at drop off, it made no sense. And another thing that he did that was very mysterious at the time, it makes perfect sense now that we know he had CVI. But, when he was about 2.5, he started to play what he called, this was his word for it, he called it the I'm nervous game. He called it a game. And when I was taking him to a visually complex scene, for example, like to the local grocery store, he'd say, "I'm nervous, Mom. I'm nervous," in the car on the way there. And I'd be like, "Why are you nervous? We're just going to the grocery store. We go every week." And he'd say, "I don't know. I don't know." And come to find out, 15 years later, that actually going to the grocery store is one of the most stressful things that you can do to a person with CVI because visually complex scenes like the grocery store, it's like, where's Waldo, right?
No, it's
And
like
I didn't,
overload. It's
it
totally like overload.
Right. I mean, I think about the book Where's Waldo, where it's just stuff everywhere, right? And it's actually very common for people who have CVI to express anxiety about going to the grocery store just because it's so visually overwhelming. And that's a function of dorsal stream impairment. There's two, when the light hits the retina, it's transmitted into an electrical signal. It travels through the optic nerve past the LGN to the back of the brain. And that's when conscious perception of sight begins. And there's two streams of visual processing. There's the dorsal stream and the ventral stream. The dorsal stream, people who have dorsal stream impairment very often have difficulties with visually crowded scenes like Where's Waldo, like going to the grocery store. They have difficulty or they absolutely can't pick out a face in a crowd, right? They just can't do that because the part is damaged, that part of their brain. The ventral stream is kind of more through the middle of the brain, and that's where visual recognition takes place, like through the right fusiform gyrus, where we talked about facial recognition, object recognition, environmental recognition, words, letters, numbers, right? And so here is my son at the age of 2.5 giving all the classic symptoms of CVI, saying, I'm afraid to go to the grocery store. I'm nervous. I'm nervous. I'm nervous. But he was calling it a game. He wasn't throwing temper tantrums. He wasn't like freaking out and crying at the store. And so here I am at the doctors and going, and they're like, oh, it's probably just seeking negative attention. Just distract him with something else, you know, that was completely brushed under the rug. And in reality, that's actually a common symptom of CVI. It's common, and
That's
nobody
really
knew. His
interesting.
doctor didn't know. I didn't know. Nobody knew. And, again, here's this child who's making eye contact, who's reading, who's very athletic and is running around,
Well,
playing
come on, he
t-ball.
has a huge vocabulary if he knows the word nervous at 2.5,
Oh, yeah, he had
right?
an enormous he was extremely verbal, right? So very, very
Yeah.
verbal, gifted
So
kid.
the other thing I wanted to ask you is, do you ever think about all the things he might not have done
Oh, absolutely. Oh my
if you
goodness.
had figured this out earlier? I mean, even in school, they would have never put him on the water polo team
All right,
if
and
they
I
had
never
thought
would.
he was blind,
Right,
right?
right, and we talk about this actually. I was talking about this with the friend who didn't get diagnosed till she was 26. She's an opera singer in Iceland. She's just amazing, and it if I had known that Sebastian had CVI, I would have been terrified for his safety, and I know personally I would have totally overprotected him. And, before we knew, I mean, when he was like 10, I think we went on vacation in Colorado and we went whitewater rafting and they stopped at this point in the river where they allowed people to jump off this giant boulder 50 feet into the water. And my son was the first one off the boulder, throwing himself into the water, right? My blind kid, like we had just no idea, right? And I know, like, had I known, they were like, no, you can't do that. And, it's such a double-edged sword because, like, it was such a blessing because he developed such independence because I didn't overprotect him, and at the same time, he was traumatized, right? Because he didn't get the support that he needed, and what's needed is a balance, right? We need a balance for these kids. They need to get the skills early on. They need to get they need the support they need right away, and then they also need parents to not be terrified, and worried that they're,
Gonna do
so.
something wrong,
Oh,
or
that
that
yeah.
their kid's not normal. I mean, excuse me, who is normal? Give me the break, right?
Well, and I don't think that that's the fear. There's actual research showing that blindness typically it's such a primal fear for typically sighted people. I think it's just comes from like our inner cave person, right? Of being afraid of not being able to see at night or anytime. It's such a primal fear that there's actual research showing that parents would prefer that their child have a diagnosis of a terminal form of cancer than be blind. They're
I mean,
so
there's so many
afraid.
tools to
Oh, I
deal
know.
with blindness in the
Right.
world. I mean, even in your book, you talk about the app that
Yeah,
does directions and
yeah, yeah,
locations and
it's never I mean, people who have blindness have always been able to live happy, productive, important,
and
contributing lives as fully blind
independent
people.
lives,
Independent
independent
lives,
lives.
right?
Yeah,
They've always been able to do that, and it's not different now. It's just easier now than it's ever been with technology. Makes it easier, right? I mean, we've got Uber.
right, right.
It's such an
So that
amazing thing,
yeah,
So,
no, it's
yeah,
amazing.
but it's
And
it's a primal fear for typically sighted people that I think results in real harms to blind people. And here's where I'd like to give a shout out to my friend Kristen Smedley, who's the author of Thriving Blind. She has two blind sons, and she works so
wow,
hard to contribute to change the stereotypes about blind people needing, not being able to do things. Her sons are amazing, and they're just off living their lives and successful. And just like my son is successful, and thank goodness for Leader Dogs for the Blind. They paid all his expenses to fly him out, and they gave him intensive orientation and mobility training with the white cane and, all expenses paid. And my son is now independent. He lives downtown
In
independently,
Chicago,
he's
right?
off in college, yeah, he's just having a great time, and he's safe now because he just needed a little bit of help, and he's safe,
Right.
you
I
know?
also think that, again, I want to go back to the early music and movement because I think this is important, not just for children who might have CVI
Mhm.
to get this exposure, but the way for safety, right? How children are put in that little car seat like a dead bug and left there, moved around for
Thank you.
hours and hours.
Thank you for bringing this up. We have an epidemic of sensory processing disorders because children are stuffed in car seats, stuffed into strollers, stuffed into they are confined. Children need to experience movement, and movement and music together are the really awesome ways that parents can they have to have movement in order to develop a normal neurological sensory processing system. Our ears actually have two purposes. Our ears have the hearing listening side of them, but they also have the balance and proprioceptive part of everything. Um, and the hearing, listening, and the balance and coordination thing are not separate from each other. As
Ah,
a music and movement specialist, we know that if one of those systems is out of whack, then the other one is likely to be out of whack as well. And that's why when you combine music and movement together, that you get such powerful rewards with balance, coordination, fine and gross motor skills. Research have actually known for many years that problems with like physical developmental delays, they're often rooted in the inner ear, right? It's coordination, fine and gross motor skills. And so music and movement, there's decades of research showing you can help this. These children who have CVI, they don't have to be developmentally delayed. And I mean, I
no
can't.
child, no child, right? And part of the work you did was parents there with their children, right?
Oh yeah,
Doing it.
yeah.
And so
It's a
that this
mu- music.
communication.
Yeah, Music Garden is a parent-child, program for infants, toddlers, preschoolers. It goes up to age 10. It eventually goes into piano lessons. But yeah, that's what I did is, I considered myself to be my parents, the music teacher for the parents. And so I taught the parents how to play musically with their children, you know, and so that they could take what we learned in that half hour once a week class and go home and do it every day, because half an hour a week or an hour a week is not enough for the type of neuroplastic changes that you want to see in a baby's brain. And that's part of the Music Garden program, right? It's specifically part that you're expected to do these activities at home every day. And that's exactly what I just did with Sebastian accidentally, just because I love music, right? And so, when I was happy, I was dancing around with him and marching around to Sousa marches, and when it was nap time, they were, quiet lullabies, and he was
Lullabies.
rocked, and they were bouncing games, and all different body awareness rhymes when he was changing him on the changing table. All these little things, they matter. They
Well,
matter.
and this is the thing that although, you know, you might wish you had discovered this earlier and gotten him certain services earlier. In the bigger picture of things, there was healing going on all the time.
Oh, yeah, and that's another thing I talk about at the end of the book. If I had known that my son suffered a stroke at birth, I would have been afraid to handle him like a healthy infant. I handled him like a healthy infant, and I twirled him around and I danced with him every day. This newborn baby, and I was dancing around the house with him, and and if I had actually known that he'd suffered a stroke, none of that would have happened. And so, yeah, yeah,
So
it's
it's a
such a
partly it's a mystery. Some of it is a mystery,
oh, yeah, some of
and
it's blind luck. I mean,
I
in
just
fact yeah, go ahead.
I'm just so glad that you have through your journey that you found all this information that will and that you push the medical establishment to do something differently.
Well, because I knew Sebastian had taught himself to do this with the visual processing, with the words. I figured out how he did it. It was with art. And so I thought if my son could teach himself, then this is a teachable skill.
And other
Damn it.
people could learn
Other
it.
peop
Yeah.
other
Yeah.
people could learn it because it doesn't cure the vision, but it sure is a handy skill. It allowed my son to pass for typically sighted for 15 years. It allows him to function independently because he can guess who and what things are around him accurately, you know? And so it was so important to me because I'm just like, this is important information that could help other people who have CVI.
Well, and getting the research studies going and I mean, this is sometimes we don't understand when we start, right? You just started going to the doctors to get Sebastian help.
Oh yeah.
You had no idea how
Oh
this was
no.
going to grow.
I mean,
And
I no idea.
and so part of this is to stay true to yourself, right? To
Mhm.
what you maybe know, and all the people who were supposed to know telling you that logically you couldn't know this was wrong with him. This isn't wrong with him. We can't, but you're like, no, I know
Oh, I knew
and
what I saw. I mean, I'll just
right,
never I still get goosebumps every time I talk about it. Sitting there on the sofa with Sebastian and him not recognizing his own face after half an hour of looking at pictures of his own face, and then him being like having no idea who it was, and like the hairs on my arms, they just stand up. They're doing it right now. It was like, I know what I saw. I knew I
right,
was right. And then the next
right,
day, it was just like, I know I'm right. I know my kid. Right.
right,
And so that mother's instinct, nobody knows your child better than you do. Nobody
right.
does, and I think what you said about the doctors just I think the thing that was strangest in our whole journey, that diagnostic journey, was that there were people throughout, non-medical professionals, who absolutely believed me and took me at my word. And so I would talk to this, one person, like my friend Patty, the occupational therapist who helped us, and she's just like, "Oh, I've never heard of this, but yeah, I totally believe you, right?" And then we go to a doctor's office and be treated like we were aliens, like dangerous aliens out to, harm the world. And then we'd go, and I found a speech therapist, and the speech therapist, she was amazing. She was just like, "Oh yeah, I've had students who've had diagnoses before." "Oh, okay." And then you go to the doctors and they're like, "You just can't possibly have that." It's
No,
so
no,
rare.
no. But the
Yeah.
perseverance to keep going,
Yeah.
and to keep working, and then to share what you have learned with people. I want everybody to know I'm gonna run your little things again, but they're in the description. Your Facebook page is in the description. Your website is in the description.
Thank you.
Um, if we can put a link to your book and comments, and if people watch this and have questions or want more information, we can put anything in the comments, like links to some of the organizations, resources, and stuff like that. Because I think that it's important to share the uniqueness of each human, and that's what gets lost when you go somewhere and they go, if this then that, if this then that, if this then that, if this then that, as a diagnostic tool, instead of the person looking at the person they're working with who came to them for help, the way
Well, and
you
I
look
I
at
would
your son.
thank you. I just wanted to address, in my experience, that our medical system, a lot of doctors are extremely ableist, and we were repeatedly told that all children who have CVI are severely developmentally delayed, which is a myth. That's not true. And that because of that, their vision was the least of their problems, so it just didn't matter if they never got diagnosed. And I mean, the lack of care for these people is horrifying. The total absence of concern for them as human beings. and the total absence of concern that they get the services that they need. You have to have a diagnosis of vision impairment or blindness to get vision impairment and blindness services. You have to. They don't just hand those out to people. And it's the challenges, even with the diagnosis, are overwhelming. Even with that, it's so difficult for families to get the services. So it
So any resources you have that you want to put in the comments of this post,
absolutely.
and
Mhm.
we
I
will
have
just
lots.
share them. I'm sure you have a million.
Yes, there will be lots.
And also to not give up and to celebrate the uniqueness. And there's so much Sebastian can do, even though he can't see the way I see. I can't see the way he sees. But if we share, we both have a bigger version and vision of the world. And I think that sometimes is what gets lost in medicine. If this doesn't fit in here, there's no space for it. But really, what gifts does he bring? Like you said, the whole visual cortical, I mean, like the whole word processing that opens up all kinds of doors.
Mhm. Yeah,
So
thank you. Well, I would just wanted to take a moment to thank you for this opportunity and helping me to raise awareness about the number one cause of visual impairment in the developed world. We CVI moms call CVI the common disability that no one's ever heard of. And I really, really appreciate this because I know that there are tons of other families out there and people out there who don't even know that their kid is severely visually impaired or blind, and they've been misdiagnosed. They've been overlooked, swept under the carpet, just like my son was. Like I know so many people who are now going through this. They're just discovering it now. And it's because of lack of training in the medical profession and in the educational profession. It's lack of training, but we're working hard to change that. And I have, like you said, lots of resources. If you're listening right now and you need help right now, look up cviscotland.org. That is considered by medical experts to be one of the best sources of factual and medically accurate information about CVI. It's a free website. They have actual videos that you can watch that show you what it's like to look through the eyes, through the brain of someone who has CVI and what that vision is like. And remember, every person who has CVI is different. So if you just watch one video, that's just kind of showing you like what maybe some people with CVI, it might be like for them, can be vastly different, right? So cviscotland.org. And I highly recommend if you think your child might have CVI, the only program I would recommend to get a diagnosis is Perkins School for the Blind. Dr. Barry Cran is there. They have the whole CVI now. So I'll put links for that as well. I wouldn't, that's just where I would go. If
that's
you,
where you would start.
that's where
And
I would start. Yeah, absolutely.
and and the idea that it's a journey, that there's not a once and done, that there is not a quick fix. There is just an unfolding step by step. And the fact that it's 5 years now since January 2017.
17, yeah.
And you're still healing.
Oh, yeah,
And
absolutely.
so that we can embrace this positive growth and change,
Hmm.
and how we can share and support each other.
Yeah. I mean,
So
we were forced to go public with our story basically to clear our names because my son and I were both labeled crazy by the medical establishment. And so we really felt like we had to come forward, or, every other medical issue for the rest of my life, we'd be discounted. And probably, I mean, the medical malpractice was so severe before over everything that, I mean, my son has a whole other host of other complications from another condition, and it was horrible. So we felt forced to come forward for that, but also because we knew that this was a teachable skill, the verbal visual processing, and we knew that there had to be other people out there that were going undiagnosed and misdiagnosed, and I could not live with myself and think these people are out there and not getting help. We knew that we couldn't be the only people being abused by the medical system, and it's true that what happened to us actually happens all the time. This is common. So
right,
yeah.
right. And so it's very important for people to stick together
Yeah,
in a situation like this. So thank you
absolutely.
so much, Stephanie, for sharing your journey and lots and lots of wonderful information. And I'll look forward to talking to you again.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I hope you have a wonderful holiday season.
Thank you.